You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello and welcome. I'm Rebecca Ray of the Conference Board, and I have the privilege of leading the Human Capital Center and also to deliver another one of our great Insights podcasts. So thank you very much for joining us today. Today we're going to focus on mental health and the American worker. And I think it's important that managers take note because as this pandemic drags on, the mental health of workers may be deteriorating. At least that's what our latest survey results would suggest. 57% of workers surveyed, more than 1,800 responded, said their mental health has degraded since the start of the pandemic. And the driving factor behind this decline is their workload. In fact, work pressures were so great that more than half of the respondents said that the demands are taking a bigger toll on their mental health than COVID-19 concerns. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and to welcome our guest, Dr. Srini Pillay. He's the Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of Reulay, a virtual therapeutic platform using machine learning for stress and anxiety. Srini's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, brain imaging expert, and former head of the Outpatient Anxiety Disorders Program at McLean Hospital, a Harvard Medical School affiliate. Srini, it is a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm anxious to hear your thoughts on this very, very important issue.
Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. The findings I think are both alarming, but also expected. And I think we see signs of this around us. The first thing is that if you look at what's happening in the workplace, there are currently 10.9 million open positions, according to an article in Harvard Business Review. And so it makes you wonder, what is the reason for this? I think in terms of mental health, what I've been seeing in the workplace is that people there are many companies where people have exposure, but there are a large number of companies where people do not have exposure to treatments that could be helpful. And most companies I've worked with are not necessarily personalizing the interventions. So it doesn't surprise me that just throwing apps at people or giving them, just one webinar is not really going to get to the root of the matter. I think that the workload has increased for a number of different reasons. Partly it feels that way when you're in a hybrid work environment. Partly with all of those open job positions, somebody has to take over. And so if somebody takes over, that workload falls on someone else. But I think it's more than just the workload that's troubling people. If you look at the causes of burnout, which I think in the survey were particularly high, the causes of burnout are numerous. It's work overload, but in addition to work overload, it's also lack of control, feeling like there's so much uncertainty that it actually takes a toll on you. Also, insufficient reward. People are working long hours and don't feel like they're rewarded enough. And there are other things like community breakdown, absence of fairness, that really start to take a toll on people when they're thinking of things.
Well, I think that's spot on. The findings of our most recent survey of American workers, and we've done a variety of these for the last year and a half, and we focused on mental health this time, very cognizant of the fact that many in the profession believe there's a coming tsunami of mental health issues. But it's also World Mental Health Day on Sunday, October 10th. And I wanted to get a sense of American worker sentiment around this. And to your point, what we found was that nearly 8 in 10 are concerned about their mental health. Now, we asked this very same question just a few months ago. Back in June, only 55% indicated that was the case for them. And now we have 77% who are indicating that. And I think you're right. It is workload, and it is, I think, the sheer length of this time that we're in. I think all of us as workers can step up and say, well, I'm going to put in extra effort, and I don't want to let our team down. I don't want to, miss the goals that we have of taking care of customers or clients. And most of us can do that for a relatively short period of time, thinking it's probably a sprint. But when it becomes a marathon and there's no sort of light at the end of the tunnel, that's a challenge. And I do think people were more optimistic a few months ago. They thought that perhaps they were beginning to see the end. And I think that has really impacted a lot of people.
Yeah, I think there are people who feel like they are coping. And I think coping is not a strategy. I think one actually has to be proactive in order to solve some of these issues. And, for a lot of people, I think a lot of people are actually unaware of what the symptoms of particular mental health syndromes are. So for example, if you're suffering from depression, it's not just depressed mood, it's problems sleeping, decreased interest in day to day activities, prominent guilt feelings, decreased energy, decreased concentration, decreased appetite, feeling slowed down, or even having suicidal ideation. And it's all of these symptoms that, when they come together, start to take a toll on a person. Anxiety is also at an all time high. And I think people often feel ashamed to say that they're anxious, not realizing that a large proportion of the workforce is actually really anxious right now.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because we did specifically ask the question about whether or not people felt that they had a supportive manager, that their manager genuinely cares about their well-being. And 75% of our respondents said that they did feel that they worked for a caring manager. But we also asked the question whether or not they thought their supervisor would, or perhaps even has, made adjustments to the workload to address mental health issues. And that number was significantly lower at 55%. I think there's still, we asked the question, how comfortable are you speaking out about your physical challenges? And that's always a much higher number. And how many were comfortable speaking out about their mental health challenges? And that number drops a lot. And to your point, it is very true. It's about workload. It's also about the blurred boundaries, I think.
Absolutely. I think systems matter a lot. So, for example, a study that was done recently with physicians found that 29% of physicians with the highest resilience scores were also burnt out. And what this tells us is that it's not enough to be resilient. The system at work has to also cater to that. So when there are unclear roles, or when people are not prepared to work in an environment that is committed to change, the system breaks down. And so you get a particular kind of community breakdown that makes it very difficult to not be burnt out. So the point there that I want to make is that if you're feeling burnt out, it's not that you're not resilient necessarily. You might be the most resilient person in the office, because in that study, some of the most resilient people were still burnt out. So to your point, I think systems matter and the way in which systems are actually created. So for example, McKinsey had put out an article talking about fitter, flatter, faster organizations. And one of the things that I think a lot of people are doing right now is not actually thinking about how in the environment of hybrid work they could operate more effectively in a non-hierarchical way by allowing people to take greater responsibility for what they have. If you're in control of your schedule and you know that there's a goal, and everybody knows that there's a deadline for that goal, it matters much more. It will have much less of an impact on you from a burnout perspective if you can control your own schedule. But if someone is micromanaging you and saying, how far are you and how far have you gone, this actually accentuates the feeling of a heightened workload.
You know, I I think the matter of control is truly key here because when you look at the reported rates of feeling as though their mental health had deteriorated, more women reported this than did men at 60% versus 48. Millennials indicated that they had more of they assessed more of a decline in their mental health. And I think that speaks to people who are earlier in career. And we can talk another time about the lower percentage of leaders in who are women. And my concern is that so much of this last year and a half, the pandemic and social unrest, a lot of women have opted out of the workplace. And my fear is that we have lost much of the progress that we've made in recent years in bringing women in and keeping women in leadership ranks. So I think there's something to be said about how much control there is if you're earlier in career or if you happen to be in a lower organizational status position. And that's got to play into this feeling of control, right?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I do when I'm working with organizations is help them get beyond just the superficial interventions. Sleep more, eat better, make sure you get a rest. I mean, these are all really important things, but it's also important to know what to do when you're in a particular situation. For example, we know about uncertainty, that uncertainty can overactivate parts of the brain such that 75% of people may mispredict when bad things are going to happen. Meaning, when you're not in control, your brain goes into catastrophe mode and it starts making up stories like, instead of saying it's uncertain and I don't know, your brain brings up messages like, there's a threat, something terrible is going to happen. And if you're in that chronic state of fear, it's going to lead to exhaustion and it's going to worsen both things like depression and anxiety. So I think learning simple brain based techniques has been one of the things that I've done when working with organizations to help people understand how, when they need it, they can use some of these techniques. Because it's not like people are uncertain the entire day. Before a board meeting, or before you're going to present to someone, or if you don't know your way forward, you start to get a little more anxious. And if you can actually understand some basic things that you can do. For example, in the case of uncertainty that I just talked about, you can use self-talk to actually change the way in which you lead by saying, okay, I understand that I feel like everything's a catastrophe, but that's because I know that with uncertainty, the brain becomes a catastrophe machine. So I am simply going to say, I don't know, and that does not mean that something terrible is going to happen.
So, Srini, I know that a lot of people listening to this podcast probably work at organizations where those companies have really tried, right? They've offered a variety of things. There's been training, there's employee assistance programs, there's flexible work arrangements, which, by the way, people said it was probably one of the greatest elements that helped support their mental health was the flexibility that organizations offered. But organizations have tried to put a lot of things in place, things about well-being, things about nutrition. And I think that the concern is that when you ask people how effective those things were, many of them said they were either not helpful or slightly helpful at best. And that was more than half of the surveyed population of 1,800 people. So what's the disconnect? Because I think organizations are trying. I think a lot of people, particularly those who are in leadership positions in the human capital space, they are looking to support their workers. They understand the need to attract and retain great talent and to keep them as productive and as balanced as they possibly can against a backdrop of a world gone crazy. What's the disconnect?
Well, I think there are a number of different reasons for this. From my perspective, what I've seen within organizations is that the organizations that are the most successful are the ones where this attention to mental health is becoming part of the culture. And I think, at the C-suite level, there's always a consideration of, well, I'm not somebody's doctor, or I'd like to take care of somebody, but I'm not sure how much we should be doing. And the work still needs to get done. On the other hand, there is tremendous evidence to show that there's absenteeism, presenteeism, decreased productivity when mental health is affected. So it does affect the financial bottom line. And I think greater clarity on the financial bottom line is very important in order to understand how the mental health programs are actually tying in to the business goals. Secondly, I'm a big fan of organizations where there is a strong connection between human resources and the C-suite. And that's because I think when there is that connection, it becomes part of the company culture. But when human resources operates in a completely different place and then the C-suite represents the business, then the actual conversation around mental health, I think, becomes a little bit more shallow. In one organization, for example, what I particularly liked about how they were addressing this was they said, we don't just want this to be about a program or two programs or two workshops. What we want to do is create a year-long and possibly longer initiative that addresses onboarding, that addresses the larger population, and that addresses the leadership team. And first, we need to get buy-in from the leadership team so that they have a deep understanding of what we're doing with the rest of the organization, and so that they can lead differently. They can become more informed about mental health. They can know how to have conversations about it. They can know what adjustments to make. And when you see an organization making an attempt where they're actually trying to transform the entire culture, I think that you're much more likely to be successful, because then you don't have the elephant in the room about, well, how much money are we spending and how much money are we making as a result of that. I also think that for different organizations and different people, there are probably different challenges. So I think, for example, in a highly urban corporation where that has been significantly impacted by the pandemic and the density of people, the level of fear may be different than a company that's located out in the country, or a company that's entirely working from home. So it's important to understand what applies to that company and to collect data on that. I'm a big fan of actually trying to understand what the ROI of particular programs is when it comes to mental health. Rather than saying we've got a bunch of different things you can try, which is always, it comes from a place of goodwill. I think it would help the organization and people more to understand what that ROI is. I also think that we are in an age right now where precision medicine is making it over into the workplace, meaning it's not everybody responds to an intervention in the same way, and different people like different things. So trying to personalize interventions is what I believe will actually make a difference.
I believe that's absolutely spot on. I mean, I think it is about tailoring. I think it is about understanding what's really causing these things, and also to have flexible offerings, just the same way workers tell us consistently. They want a flexible work world, and they are going to walk with their feet and go somewhere where they can find that flexibility. I think the same could be said about they're going to go somewhere where they're going to get the support that they need to be who they are and productive and connected to the mission and the purpose in a way that they can balance in their lives. I think that's what we're seeing now with this great reset. I know that you've been at the forefront of addressing mental health and anxiety issues for a long time. And I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about the work that you and the team at Reulay are doing.
Absolutely. So Roulet is a machine learning platform because we want to personalize interventions that we're offering. And we are offering, to start out, an experience in virtual reality, which is designed to decrease anxiety. So I always laugh when people think that the solution to anxiety is to be calm, because having run an anxiety disorder service, I think the worst thing you could say to someone who's anxious is be calm. So calmness is one of the solutions that we offer, but we also have a bunch of other parts of the anxiety circuitry that we are looking at. We help to decrease worry. We are also helping to decrease body tension, to improve focus, to help people feel less stuck, to enhance the sense of possibility, and in certain instances where this is applied, to experience a sense of awe. There's a lot of research to show that each of the things that I just mentioned can help change a person's mood. But what I'm particularly excited about is, recent studies have shown that the reason I'm concerned about mental health is not only because of the mental health, but the brain and the body are connected. And we now know that stress and anxiety and mental health, poor mental health in general, can lock genes. And when this locks genes, it opens up disease pathways to cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease. So I'm giving a talk at the end of this year in Sweden that's entitled, and it's only to CEOs, and it's entitled, "You didn't sign up to be a doctor, but you are." Because the truth is, the work is often the scene of the crime when it comes to stress impacting genes and leading to chronic disease. And at Reulay, we have a program called Gene Care, where we believe if you can brush your teeth twice a day to prevent dental caries, why wouldn't you take care of your genes twice a day? And we're excited because our preliminary data has actually shown that we were able to, not only are we safe and feasible, but we're able to decrease anxiety and nervousness and jitteriness. And I still believe, though, that this needs to be personalized. And some people will respond to it well, some people may not respond to it as much. Virtual reality, for me, is a very exciting medium in which to deliver mental health interventions, because unlike two-dimensional interventions, you're actually immersed in an environment. And mental health is strongly impacted by how immersed you are in the calmness, not just hearing about the calmness or being cognitive. This immersion itself actually makes a big difference. And there are a large number of other advantages of this, but for me, one of the things that I'm interested in is, you asked at the beginning, what's the disconnect? And I think one of the disconnects is that most people are not aware of, for good reason, and not talking about free floating anxiety. I think of free floating anxiety as it's basically without a cause. The human brain is wired, and being alive is such that a lot of people have a baseline level of free floating anxiety. Now, the temptation is to attach to narrative, whether that's a political narrative, a social narrative, a personal narrative. And then people imagine that that narrative is going to take care of that anxiety, but it never does. And the reason we're feeling the weight that we're feeling in corporations right now is, I believe, that people have settled into their camps, but they're finding that that anxiety has not gone away. And so learning how to address free floating anxiety, I think, is going to be the next step for companies that have tried a lot of things and are finding that this is not really working.
Well, I think that's a fascinating take. And we could probably have a very long conversation about how much is it the corporation's responsibility to do these kinds of things. I love the title of your upcoming talk. You may not have signed up to be a doctor, but it's true. And when you think about folks in the human capital space, I mean, they've been at the forefront of addressing people's basic needs for food security, a paycheck, housing, safety. I mean, and we've expected our workers to perform against this backdrop of an awful lot of things coming at them from headlines and news feeds and personal experiences. And for those of us who've had the privilege of working remotely through much of this, it's difficult to imagine the even higher level of anxiety of those folks who are on the front lines, taking care of patients in hospitals. It's been an extraordinary time, and yet people have been productive. I think it's not sustainable. Now, my question to you is, let's say that someone works for a great company that's doing innovative things, and they're offering all kinds of innovative support for mental health and well-being. And even if they do, or perhaps if they're not at an organization that has that in place, where can people go? How can they start? Because one of the things we found is that many people don't even have a mental health regimen. They might have a physical health regimen, but they don't have a mental health regimen. And we also found that they were better able to keep up their physical health regimen than their mental health regimen. So what support, what resources are out there for people to uncover, to begin to address these things if they have to, take it upon themselves to do so?
Well, one of my go-to spots to answer the question that you're asking is LinkedIn Learning. So LinkedIn Learning has a number of different courses on stress, anxiety, and mental health. In fact, I taught some of the classes in depression and anxiety and neuroscience in the workplace, and addictions. And they're actually very basic courses that are all about, this is how you identify the symptoms. If you're experiencing this, what's the first step, second step, or third step? So it's really whittled down, and it's easy to understand. I also think it's important for people who are running these programs to set up meetings with experts of various kinds to see what the interventions are that they have, to understand the data behind that, and to try to then see if they can collect data themselves. So I think, to answer your question, I think LinkedIn Learning would probably be my number one go-to spot. I also know that McKinsey has been really focusing on mental health a lot, and the McKinsey, if you Google McKinsey mental health, you'll actually see a large amount of data that will help you understand where companies are, where businesses are, and what businesses are doing. So I think that for sort of practical interventions, LinkedIn Learning would be a go-to place. I think for perspective and for an understanding of where things are going, I think that McKinsey's writing has been pretty extensive.
Well, I'm listening to all this, and I know, we only have a few more minutes together, but I'm wondering if you're optimistic that companies will sort this and that collectively we'll be able to better support American workers. How optimistic are you?
Right now, I don't think I'm optimistic given the data because I think we're seeing a decline in mental health. But I think that I'm optimistic about people who are in charge and people who care. And so I think given that, I also think that there needs to be a balance between resilience building and coping and also living into possibility, having a winning mindset. Because I think if all of the information and conversation is around how do I cope and what must I do, I think it can bring people down. People have a certain kind of longing to live into their greatest selves. And so also helping to understand what possibility thinking is, what a growth mindset is, how you can apply this to innovation, and then making some changes systemically, things like job crafting or project based teams could match people and their competencies to things that they're really good at. The one thing we know about human motivation is that the leading theory in motivation is self determination theory. And in order to remain motivated, there are three factors that are important: competence, autonomy, and social relations. How good am I at the thing that I'm being given? Do I have the freedom to do my best? And am I connected to people who will support me? I think if we can think about that on small teams, in the context of the entire organization, I think that there's a lot to be said for why we can be optimistic. I also think that having a deeper understanding of this free floating anxiety and not relying on narratives to carry um, the anxiety of being alive is important. And mostly, I think I would want to say to people that if you're feeling distressed and you're feeling unsettled in some way and you're feeling like your mental health is not optimized, you're not alone. And I think your survey demonstrates exactly that the majority of people are actually feeling that way.
I do think this is a serious issue in the workplace, and I'm hopeful that when folks have a chance to see some of your work or hear this podcast or read some of the research or attend some of the webcasts that we have at the conference board on this topic, that they will be able to move forward, because I do think losing hope is probably the worst thing that could happen. And one last question for you. I think in your comments talking to CEOs, they didn't sign up to be a doctor. I don't think leaders signed up to be playing junior psychologist either. And yet we have asked our leaders to make sure that they check in with their teams before they check on the work, to be an ear, to offer support, to be as flexible as they can. And I recognize sometimes there are constraints in the workplace that may not give someone an awful lot of options that he or she might like to give to their team. But what's the best thing that leaders can do now to support their people through this?
I think if you have any kind of ambivalence around this, reflect on how you would feel if a child was going to school and the teacher said, I didn't sign up to be a psychologist or a doctor. And if the child was distressed and the teacher said, you're here to learn, so I'm going to ignore your distress. It's the same thing. Just because we're grown up doesn't mean that we don't need that form of care. So I would say that my perspective on care is that it can occur appropriately within that context at work. I think my biggest advice to leaders is I also understand the perspective of I'm not a psychologist or I'm not a doctor and I don't know what to do. Reach out to a team of people, hire people you can turn to and people you trust, and work continuously with them together to be able to strive to get to the goals that you want to get to. I think having some goal in mind will, I think, be helpful to any organization in terms of mental health. Do we want to measure a sense of possibility? Do we want to measure how the sense of possibility is translating into innovation? I think getting together, connecting the worlds of mental health with business is where we are. It's not about just paying attention to mental health. I think in the workplace, it's specifically about how do I grow my business with people who are happy and satisfied.
I've often thought that leaders who can display empathy and can be vulnerable opens up a lot of possibilities for people generally. So, well, Srini, I'll give you a last opportunity to make any comment that you might like before we say goodbye.
Well, just that I think the one thing that is hopeful is that there's a lot of research and there are a lot of resources out there, and there are a lot of people who could potentially help. And there are ways to access resources remotely, digitally, online, and in person. So I think researching this is where I think we should start, because from your survey, it's clear that there are a lot of well-intentioned leaders and a lot of employees who still haven't been touched by their intentions. And I think it's important to be able to close that gap.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so very much for joining me today, Srini. This is an important issue, one that will take a lot of effort and uh, a lot of thoughtfulness around how we do this. Because to your point earlier, everyone's going to come at this a different way and be in a different place. And so, thinking about how we support the multitude of workers is going to be vital. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us on another Insights podcast here from the Conference Board, today on mental health and the American worker. Again, this is Rebecca Ray. It's been my privilege to join you, and I hope you'll take advantage of the entire C-suite of podcast series that we have for you. Thank you again. Goodbye now.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.